Again, I just want to welcome you all to this third session of the three-part series on housing put on by the South Shore Chamber of Commerce. My name is Courtney Biergard. I lead our housing initiative here at the Chamber. I want to take just a couple of minutes for those of you who are not familiar with our work to tell you just a little bit about it. Our chamber is more than just a traditional business-to-business networking organization. About 5 or 6 years ago, we created and launched an economic and community development plan. Our ultimate goal was really to advance the economic well-being of the South Shore and its business community today and for future generations. The plan, which is called South Shore 2030, really focuses on building a regional workforce by encouraging things like greater housing options, increased infrastructure capacity, and attracting businesses to our region. Addressing things like transportation challenges, congestion, long commutes. It's exciting work. We've made some great progress. We're kind of excited for where 2021 is going to bring us, and excited to be having this panel today with some fantastic experts in this water and wastewater space. So just real quick, I also want to acknowledge our 2030 funders, and specifically our housing initiative funders. Without them, we could not do this work. So it's so important for us to have local businesses who step up. I want to go ahead and recognize Rockland Trust Bank, Massachusetts Housing Partnership, Cape Cod Lumber, Fire King Baking Company, and Sullivan Tire. A quick overview of today's schedule. I'm going to ask that you hold your questions and your comments until the end of the presentations. At that time, we will open it up for Q&A. I'll ask that you either use the chat function or use the raise your hand function on Zoom, and I will call on as many people as we can. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Today, we're going to take a little bit of time to hear from some economic development experts on a very important topic to our region. Not super exciting always, but very important to economic development, water and wastewater capacity. We're really eager to bring more investment to the region, to attract businesses, and to build out our housing options. But a big piece of that economic development puzzle is water and wastewater capacity. So important, in fact, that the Chamber, a business association, has identified it as a top priority in our own work. We've invested time, energy, and money to examine opportunities for collaboration, which you'll all hear a little bit about later. And of course, that's why we're all here today. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over to the experts. Again, today we're really lucky to have Chris Zimmerman from Smart Growth America, Martin Pillsbury and Betsy Cowan-Neptune from Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and Jim Boudreau, who's a town administrator for Scituate, here with us today. I'd like to start by introducing Chris Zimmerman, the VP of Economic Development for Smart Growth America. It's a national nonprofit providing technical economic development expertise. Chris, I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over to you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. I hope at some point I get to visit people like you actually where you are, because it would be great to be able to get back up to Massachusetts again. But be that as it may, this is good to at least have this opportunity to talk. I'm going to lead us off by talking in somewhat general terms, pretty broadly to start, and narrowing it a little bit, but the subsequent speakers are really going to get into the specific detail, and then we'll have a chance to talk about all these issues and answer questions that you have. And I want to start by really at the broadest level of economic development and what it means in the 21st century, and how things are significant now that when a lot of us were growing up in the last century, were rather different. So, to start with, we need to note a couple of things. We inherited some stuff in the 20th century that is sort of embodied in the way, in the practices we have and the laws and ordinances that we've inherited for the most part. And that was really based on ideas in the 20th century that ensconced in law notions, particularly through things like our zoning code is one particularly important example, an extreme separation of uses as opposed to mixed use development, planning that was entirely really around automobile usage, and a change in the way we did everything from, the most basic infrastructure, streets and roads, to the to the way we placed buildings and so on, and really got away from what I would say was the previous 10,000 year history of making towns. And there were consequences to that. And we learned some things, and some things the hard way, and some things we maybe haven't entirely learned. But what we certainly have found and see is that there were some good reasons for the way people built towns and cities for 10,000 years. And for half a century or so, we got away from that because of particular circumstances that made it possible to do it. But it's not working real well in the 21st century for a variety of reasons. And what we find is that, more and more, it's clear that having places that people want to be is a real key to economic performance, both in terms of the return on the private sector side and for governments. A lot of this, ties very closely to the major acts of the public sector on the infrastructure side. We can't do much in the way of economic activity in the private sector without a certain amount of supporting infrastructure that requires some level of government involvement, usually government investment. That, again, the streets, the roads, the stuff that goes under and the stuff that goes above. So the water, infrastructure from the pipes all the way to the treatment plants are vital to make it possible for any of these activities to happen. And they create value. They create value by raising, they produce greater value in the real estate around them, and therefore induce investment that has all the returns to economic activity that we're looking for. But an important component of this, it's easy to lose, and this is the thing that I think was most lost in our drive to make all of our development drivable in the 20th century, is that agglomeration, which is to say the mixing of things in close proximity of activities, is a key to creating economic value. When you have a lot of stuff close together, basically, it means that the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And that's really what's driven the success of villages, towns, cities, ever since we started making them as human beings. And we've lost a lot of that with development that has spread things around so much. But we also, at the same time, drove up our costs. So infrastructure winds up being more costly, and because the economic value that supports it is less productive, the land is less productive, that means on net terms, we have some real challenges, and it's created fiscal problems for communities all around the country. But we also can see the places where things are working and how, capturing some of that value can be so key. Now, just to quickly run over again, this may be stuff everyone knows, but it's worth, I think, saying, which is that we had significant economic and demographic changes as we went from the 20th century to the 21st century. On the economic side, the shift away from, a manufacturing-based economy to a knowledge economy, the demographic change of the retirement of the baby boom and the rise of the millennials in the workforce, and the changes in preference that have gone with that. And that has had a really big impact. Again, on the economic side, this tools from tools and schools to eds and meds was a quote from somebody in actually Worcester, Massachusetts, that I heard a couple of years ago. But again, basically, we now have an economy where instead of chasing smokestacks, we're chasing talent. Instead of development being necessarily about factories, and particularly necessarily being about things like natural resources, the main resource is the workforce. And on the demographic side, of course, we've got these two big generations, the millennials and baby boomers, or perhaps I should say the baby boomers and their offspring, my children, the millennials. Again, lots said about this. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it because I think most know, but there's no, overstating the impact because they are such large generations, and they'll have all kinds of implications. In particular, the impact on the demand for housing and the particular type of housing that we need more of, and as opposed to what we have. The other thing is that, all the surveys, and, if you look at National Association of Realtors, the younger generation definitely is looking for more walkable development. And that's why they've been moving to more urban places. But those of us, getting on and maybe thinking about retiring, we also are looking for that. And these are smaller households too. So, again, it's going to change the type of housing that there's demand for in the market. And, this is drawing on the work of a number of folks, particularly Chris Nelson out at the University of Arizona. And, you can see this counted different ways, but this is one example that these sort of newer households that are forming and downsizing older folks account for, the large bulk of the housing market for years and years to come. And generally that means smaller units because, if you're retiring, only have 2 of us. I have 3 empty bedrooms upstairs where we used to have kids, but they have their own houses now and so on. And younger people who are generally putting off having children longer and having fewer. So, we've seen for a good number of years now, again, the trend of particularly educated millennials moving in and younger. If they go to the older and younger, the Gen Xers ahead of them, the Gen Z or whatever we're calling them behind them, moving into more urban places. And we've seen concomitantly that real estate prices have reflected that, with more growth in these walkable urban areas than in the car-oriented suburbs in office and residential. As I said, we basically got, in the words of Professor Nelson, the wrong housing stock for the 21st century. The housing demand that we have going forward is very different than the demand in the post-World War II era, where we had a large portion of the population characterized by, mom and dad and a couple of kids. We still have some of that, but it's a much smaller fraction of our society. So basically what we've got is a stock we've built up heavily of single family homes, especially those on large lots separated a long way. And we have a very small percentage of the population for whom that is the ideal kind of housing. So the bottom line is we need more housing, but we need more housing in particular that is on smaller lots, that is multifamily, that is in walkable places and near transit. And just to make the point that, demographically, this is not something that's just going to turn around, because in fact, the population is demographically different. So if you go back to the time close to when I was born, you had a population pyramid, which means basically this is the youngest people. So this is the baby boom down here. And then this is the older people. People live longer now and they have fewer children, which means that the projections going forward are what used to be a pyramid is almost becoming a rectangle. By the time the baby boom is all retired up in here, or passing on to wherever the next places we live, the population is much less skewed as it used to be. And what it means is we have a whole lot of people in the period of life when their needs for housing are different than the house with 4 bedrooms, 2-car garage, and so on. Consequence of all this has been that companies which spent decades moving out of cities and into car-oriented places on interstates and in office parks that could only be reached by cars have been moving more and more downtown in the literal sense of center cities, but also to suburban places too that are walkable, that are in fact centers, that are town center type places. And we've seen more and more evidence of this, that the value of the economy is the value of real estate is greatest where the economy is supported by walkable places, particularly walkable urban places. And I say urban, and I use that very broadly because this is urban defined in effect by walkability. That is to say, it might be the big center of a big city in a metropolitan area, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. What it has to be is a place that has these characteristics, that you can walk around to get to things, that things are co-located, that they're near each other. And we've seen now for a couple of decades of data. This is from a report that my organization puts out every couple of years. This is the most recent one we did about 1.5 years ago, but we see it over and over again, that you can see in the value of commercial real estate that these places are outpacing any of the places in what 30, 40 years ago were the big value gainers. And again, this is from just this past year, and more evidence about it, that it's happening everywhere. It's not only happening in the big coastal cities, it's happening all across the country and in smaller towns as well as larger places. And another related to this is the importance, growing importance of transit, with transit markets outperforming the others. When you look at this report from Jones Lang LaSalle, where almost half the construction taking place in transit accessible submarkets, that's telling you something. But even when you go to the other end, when you spoke about smaller towns, that aren't going to have that kind of infrastructure, traditional main streets are doing better and better, and the places that are able to leverage those are able to do more for their local economy and their local fiscal health. So, this is essentially what the market's been telling us what it wants, and it creates a lot of challenges for much of our built places, because many of them are, they were designed in this area, they were built in this area that was entirely driven by auto-oriented development. So they have a challenge, but there's an opportunity here too. And what we're seeing is older areas that have some of the bones, some of the legacy of the pre-car era are able to leverage that. And some places that don't are simply creating it out of what they got, turning, shopping malls into town centers and so on. And again, this is being driven by, all the aspects of this that, we see over and over. And just won't spend a lot of time on this, but no, COVID-19 is not going to change all this. Eventually this is going to pass. And if anything, there's likely to be a great pent-up demand for what we all have not been able to do over the last year. And all the demographic facts and the economic facts that cause people to congregate and agglomerate are going to, kick in again. But I want to talk a little bit about what this means in terms of what at the local level, when governments make decisions about things like where they put infrastructure, what infrastructure they invest in, how they go about it, and how that combines with the decisions they make on land use, what impact that has overall economically and particularly fiscally. Because local governments do have an awful lot to say about what gets built, where it gets built, how it gets built. And that has impacts on their budgets, on the taxes, and on the cost of providing the services in ways that mostly have not been fully accounted for in the practices of the last several decades. So if you think about it, if you've got a community that is going to grow in population and it's going to be growing, this happens to be an example from a planner in Bismarck, North Dakota, just at random, but looking at how you accommodate that. If you're going to have population grow over time, where do those people go? And the tendency has been to grow out where you can do that. And so many places have annexed, and projecting forward, they can look and say, well, it looks like at the rate we're going, given the pattern we have, we just need more dirt to do that. The problem when you do that is that now you're putting all that infrastructure, spreading it over more area at much higher cost without a corresponding increase in the kind of available taxpayers to support it. And that has been the pattern throughout the United States for the past 60, 70 years. In many places, we've had the same population, it's just moved around. And now you got to serve a larger area with effectively the same tax base. Here's an example. We did some work in Macon, Georgia, Macon-Bibb County, which is a unified county city government. And, just looking at the population where it was in 1980, where much of the population was concentrated in what was Macon town, the old center of the city of Macon. But then it spread out. And if you look at this, you see that the population didn't really change. It's about 150,000 people in 30 years. The difference is that they basically all moved out from the city out into the surrounding area. So, again, this illustrates that you can see this for so many places, for, Cleveland, for Kansas City. This is what we did. And so we created a big fiscal challenge for ourselves. Because, and here's an example for a friend of mine does work in Texas, where this town grew, as you see, from 1950 to 2015. Their area grew 13 times, but the population only grew 4 times. So again, it's a lot more expensive per household, per taxpayer, anyway, look at it, to serve this. And that's really highly inefficient and winds up creating the dilemmas. Do you raise taxes? Do you cut services? As opposed to what we want is growth brings us the opportunity to increase services, cut taxes, or do some combination. So this is really, again, about the pattern of development and the decisions we make about that and how that plays into these costs. Again, infrastructure is less efficient when it's spread out more because you've got the more miles to build and maintain, more miles of water and sewer pipes to maintain, and so on. The treatment plant may be a fixed cost, but there's a big network that goes with that. And given that the treatment plant is a fixed cost, it's really expensive. You'd like to, increase, be as efficient as possible in how you use it. And you can talk about other things. Now, let me give another thing for you to think about. For the most part, when we do things like provide water, for instance, we generally charge on a unit basis. So we get, how many gallons do you use? We have a charge per gallon, and you pay so much per gallon. Use more gallons, you pay more. So you're basically paying the average cost. In this example that you can see here, each of these bars represents a situation of different kinds of density, where houses are close together, where they're farther apart, let's say. There's a certain fixed cost, that's the red portion here. So, there's a plant that's gonna have to be there, and there's just certain costs that are invariant to space. But low density basically drives the cost up because of all that extra pipe, and whereas high density lowers the average cost. What that means is that typically somebody at the average density is paying what it costs to deliver the water to them and take it from them. Whereas people in low density are paying less than that and are in effect being subsidized by the people in high density. Now, that often means that without knowing it, the people who live in, let's say, suburban single-family homes are being subsidized by people who live in apartments downtown in many cases. Neither of them are generally aware of that fact. We've done a lot of work modeling these things for communities around the country over the last several years. And, I won't spend a lot of time on the technical part of this, but basically, this shows road area per capita, but you can think of that as pipes in the water system too, because they run under the street. So you get the same kind of shape here between population density and the amount you have per capita. And that drives a lot. So when we do this and we analyze the net fiscal impact, what you're going to get from your growth in terms of additional revenue versus what's going to cost you in terms of the infrastructure you have to provide, the services, and so on, you can get the net on that. And so here's an example we did. This one was actually for Hawaii County, where it showed that if they continue doing what they were doing, they're actually in the negative. It's going to cost them more to serve the new development than it would to then they're going to get back in revenue. And that's typical. We found that in lots of places. Whereas if you use an infill strategy, if you leverage some of what you have, where you already have a lot of infrastructure in place, then you can get that positive dividend, which we're all looking for, especially those of us. And I spent a lot of my life running for public office, and you don't want to have to tell people that this year we're either going to have to raise your taxes or cut the services or do both. As I said, when you do this analysis, it's interesting to see within a town what things cost and how surprising that can be. This was work we did this past year in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And just real briefly, we basically showed 67 different places. The lines aren't all shown here, but there's 4 of them highlighted within the city, and looked at them in terms of their infrastructure, their walkability and so on, and how ones are more spread out. And what we found was that the places that are really walkable, that are near the center of town, that have this benefit of agglomeration, so they have both the benefit on the cost side of lower cost and the revenue side of being highly productive, they're generating a huge disproportionate amount of revenue. When you look at, some of in very high value suburban, these are expensive homes where wealthy people live, many of them are actually negative. That is, the revenue they're providing, even on those expensive homes, doesn't cover the costs of the services. They're in fact being covered by these other areas, which in some cases are occupied by people who are not of high income at all. On the revenue side, we look a lot at what the development pattern means for the generation of value in the real estate, and therefore revenue for the government, for the local government, but also value in the private sector side. And it turns out that any place you look, there tend to be hotspots, that there's a disproportionate amount of value created in a small percentage of the land. And that can be really significant. It shows up very strikingly. If you look at it, and we've looked at this in Massachusetts, in the whole Boston metropolitan area, and it's quite striking there. But even if you go to a rural place, like this little map here is a place called Erwin, Tennessee, which has about, I think, 6,000 people or something like that. and it's not near any major city, you see the same pattern, which is, the central area, which has this grid of streets, is the older part of town, is generating a disproportionate amount of the revenue. This is one from Louisiana, and again, this is showing that the hotspots identified constitute only about 7% of the land area, but 36% of the value. Again, the numbers are more dramatic if you go to a place like, say, Eastern Massachusetts. This is back in Macon-Bibb, and this was kind of interesting because the value here, this is up here in the north at the top, this is the wealthy area off the interstate. They have big malls and all that, the shops at River Crossing, and they are indeed, generating a lot of value. They were almost $1 million an acre, as opposed to a county average of 77,000 an acre. But this area downtown, that's the old town. It was over $1 million an acre, and this was a town that had like 30% vacancy. They hadn't even done very much with it at that point. So just to round this out, so we've done some of this work in a few places in Massachusetts over the years. This is, Fitchburg, which is, a small place. Again, you can see that a small percentage of the land area is generating a large amount of the value. If you look at specific parcels too, so here we're going to zoom in a little bit. You see this pattern where, if you can see old buildings that don't look like they're, doing a whole lot, but when you actually look at what's being generated on a per acre basis, it can be quite high. This is a less than a tenth or a little more than a tenth of an acre parcel, which is generating $1.7 million per acre. On the other hand, if you look at this building with a parking lot around it, it's using 0.4 of an acre, only generating $325,000 or $784,000 per acre. Again, what are you getting out of the land is where the value comes in, and how do you generate more value per acre? That's a lot. That has a lot to do with how you use your infrastructure and the building environment around it. If you take advantage of these hotspots and you invest in them, then you will get a much higher return. That's even more true. I mean, a main street generally will produce that. If you've got something like a transit station, then you've got a lot to work with. Just briefly, if we net these out and we look at the revenue impact that I was just talking about, the revenue side, with the cost side that I talked about, in most places, we find that with even modest changes in average density, which means mostly using the kind of development that you already have, that you can have a big improvement. So Chattanooga, for instance, where we looked at what was going on there, the increase in average density we talk about here really means not introducing anything more dense than they already have, but in neighborhoods that are essentially, smaller, older, traditional, some single family mixed with a few multifamilies, modest housing basically, that they could reduce spending by like over $1 billion over a 20-year period. Similarly, we get, in smaller places like Brookings, South Dakota, we found a similar result. Slightly larger places, so Battle Creek, Michigan, Omaha, this is Tulsa, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Again, it's just making the same point over and over again. Leveraging assets you have, old downtowns, existing infrastructure, things like transit stations, rail stations, and making it possible to have mixed use development in a relatively compact form is more fiscally sound, and it's what the market wants. So it will tend to generate more prosperity. In short, I'd say, the principle is going to be, boiled down to a few things. You need to invest in the supportive infrastructure. Overall, increase the number of residents who are in those places, it doesn't have to be everywhere. It's normally a small percentage of a town. But having those housing options and having more people be able to live there will help you then generate the places people want to be, with more commercial activity, more activity that will draw people from outside who don't live there. And with that, you need to design these public spaces fairly carefully and create a place that people want to be, that they'll want to walk, that they'll want to visit, and that some of them will want to live in. When you do that, you can make the most out of your infrastructure investments. Whether it's a big city or a small town, the same principle holds. All that changes is the number of zeros at the end. So with that, I'm going to pause and hand things off and look forward to the discussion at the end.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Chris. That was very interesting. I'm sure we will have a few questions for you. I just want to remind everyone we are going to hold the questions until the end. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Betsy Cowan-Neptune and Martin Pillsbury. Martin Pillsbury is the Director of Environment, and Betsy is the Chief of Economic Development at Metropolitan Area Planning Council. They're gonna give us a quick overview of kind of where we stand from a regional perspective, and take you through a little bit of our own joint site readiness project. So Betsy, Martin, I'm gonna turn the floor over to the two of you.
Great, thank you, Courtney. And I will share my screen. Can I just get a thumbs up from one of you if that is working? Okay, great. And let me just change my display settings, make sure. All right. Can I just get a thumbs up from you, Courtney? We're good?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Looks good.
So I'm Betsy Cowan-Neptune. I'm the Chief of Economic Development at MAPC. Just a brief note about who we are. We are a regional planning agency. So we focus on the 101 communities in the greater Boston region, so extend down to Marshfield on the South Shore. And our role really is to support municipalities and our municipal partners and other organizations to facilitate development in the region. And we're really, really honored to be partnering with the South Shore Chamber and the South Shore Economic Development Corporation because of your thoughtfulness around exactly what Chris was talking about. How do we leverage our existing assets? And then how do we tie in the connection between economic development and housing? We come from a perspective that you can't have economic development without residential development. And all of the work that's being done right now, thinking about all the shifts in our economy, how do we get people back into the workforce? How do we support small businesses? All of that also has to do with the customer base and the workforce, and that involves housing. So we're really thrilled to be partnering with you, Peter and Courtney and the rest of the team on our work in many different areas. I'm briefly going to talk about a project that we're doing. So I will advance the slide. We're doing this project with the South Shore Economic Development Corporation, and again, a nod to Rich Beal for his efforts to put this project together. It's also in partnership with Mass Development. I know we have folks on the line from Mass Development. Weston and Sampson, which is an excellent engineering firm that we're partnering with, and we are leading this project. I'm really focusing on, Chris was giving the national perspective. So then from a regional perspective, how do we facilitate development? And how do we, we know that infrastructure and water and wastewater is a major issue on the South Shore. And I'll turn it over to Martin in a second, just to give an overview of each of the municipalities. But this is a big barrier. We know some communities have some excess capacity, but most communities are stretched. And so if we want to see development, what are the solutions? And particularly one of our major areas of focus is regionalism. So how do we help communities work together? And really leverage the assets that they have to be able to develop solutions that would be greater than what they would be able to do within their individual communities. So again, the project is designed to facilitate development in the region by really focusing in on water and wastewater. So we've identified 6 sites within 5 municipalities. We're focusing on the northern section of the South Shore. And I'll just go through quickly what the sites are, and then talk about some of what we're thinking in terms of recommendations before turning it over to Martin. So on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see a busy map that initially to narrow down the sites to be selected in the study, we first said, which are the sites that could have a catalytic effect? So this is larger sites where if we solved for water and wastewater, it would be able to have more benefits for the surrounding sites. So you'll see those little yellow circles, the dotted yellow circles, that's really thinking about a cluster analysis. So if we could have a broader solution than just those sites, if we were able to solve for water and wastewater on those sites, we'd be able to also solve for broader water, wastewater issues on surrounding sites. So the sites are located in those communities that you see there. And first up in Weymouth, it's the Bristol Brothers property. Then in Hingham, we're looking at the South Shore Park, knowing that the South Shore Park also extends over into Rockland. In Rockland, we're looking at a parcel that's right behind Home Depot. We've selected 2 sites in Hanover, the Cardinal Cushing property, and also the Unicorn Realty site. And then in Norwell, we've actually selected a municipally owned site called the Wildcat property. So we're looking at those 6 sites again to look at what are the specific solutions for those sites, but then what are the broader opportunities. So we're about halfway through our analysis. We've done build out analysis now for each of the sites. Based on that, Weston and Sampson is now going to be crunching the numbers to say, what is the existing water and wastewater capacity? And then what's the delta? So what's needed to be able to facilitate the development based on the build out analysis? And then I think the real meat of our work is developing these recommendations. And it will be done in collaboration with municipal leaders, developers, the property owners, and other folks I'm sure on the call to really think about what are some broader solutions. Peter and his team have been really thoughtful about saying, we don't want to just solve for these one particular sites, we want to solve for the broader issues in the region. So that's an overview of the project. We'll be wrapping up in July. I'm going to turn it over now to Martin because as part of that project, we did just a quick analysis of the water and wastewater capacity of these communities. So I'm going to turn it over to Martin, the director of our environment department, to talk about that further.
Thank you very much, Betsy. And you can go ahead. So I'm going to present some information that was actually put together by Weston and Sampson that helps give us an overview of the existing capacity. Later in the study, as Betsy mentioned, we'll be looking at what are some potential alternatives and solutions for some of the issues, but we need to have a firm idea of where we stand in the communities now on their existing water and sewer capacities. And before I even talk about that, I just wanted to remind people that, you know, the amount of water and wastewater that is needed for various kind of developments does vary. We have methods in Massachusetts by regulation for sort of estimating the capacity needed through the Title V regulations, which are literally for wastewater, but for the most part, water supply follows a similar amount, except for that part of that water supply that might be in outdoor water use, wouldn't go into wastewater flow. So in some developments where you know you're going to have outdoor water use, irrigation, lawn maintenance, et cetera, that would be an additional amount of water supply that need to be planned for. But for planning purposes, and probably most people in the room are pretty familiar with some of this, if you're developers, you are. For residential in particular, the standard is 110 gallons per day per bedroom. So that's how you figure how much water you need to plan on for a new development. The same is true for motels, hotels. For other uses, office, retail, restaurant, et cetera, the calculations are based on either square footage for office and retail or per seat in restaurants. And just to kind of put a quick and dirty little scenario together, Betsy, the bottom of my screen is not showing. Can you move that slide up at all? Maybe, I don't know, maybe it's my problem. Can you see the bottom of the slide?
It says total mixed use development. Can you see that?
I can't see that. Maybe it's my screen. Okay.
Oh, Courtney can see it.
As long as you can see it.
Yeah.
So I had put together sort of, based on those calculations, the wastewater use factors in the table above, sort of if you look at some components of a mixed use, some of these could be standalone developments, of course, but if they were all part of a mixed use proposal, having a number, and I put different numbers here, you could do different scenarios. The only thing I'll add is that the hotel actually should be 200 rooms for this. I just need to correct that for this table. You end up with this mix of uses, end up with nearly 80,000 gallons per day in wastewater demand. So that's just to give you a sense that, you know, we're talking about fairly large amounts of volume that are needed once you start to talk about modest to larger size developments. And you can go ahead, Betsy. What we have to do here, next slide, Betsy, is think about what are the regional context for water and sewer. The first question that often comes up is, well, what about the MWRA? They're the 800-pound gorilla in the room. They're right, sort of more or less right next door. And could they be part of the solution? And the answer is it's complicated. And on the water supply side, this gives you a sense, the communities in green on this map are part of the MWRA water supply system, not the ones in yellow. The ones in yellow are only on their wastewater system. So the closest community to this group of towns that are on the MWRA water system is actually Quincy. And so the water supply is not right on the doorstep of the 5 communities we're looking at, and certainly for further south, even further. But it's not impossible to think about it. In fact, the development is being proposed for the former South Weymouth Naval Air Station, formerly known as Southfield, now I guess known as Union Park, seriously considering the MWRA connection as one of their alternatives for their ultimate build out. That was what actually was in the original proposal under the original developer, LNR, back something like 15 years ago. I believe it's still being considered as one of the options with the new developer. They're just getting started, as sort of relooking at all of this. And I will, if you jump to the next slide, Betsy, I'll show why is it that the MWRA actually could potentially provide a substantial amount of water to neighboring communities. This shows the demand on the MWRA system as a whole. This is something like 45 cities and towns. With Boston at the core of the eastern region, plus a few others that they serve in Western Mass, with the Quabbin and Wachusett Reservoir system. And if you look at this relatively dramatic decline in demand on their system that started, in fact, when the MWRA came into existence and took over the water system that had previously been run by the old MDC in 1985. Shortly thereafter, they put in together a very robust demand management program, which has actually been successful beyond almost everyone's wildest dreams. The system was, the red line you see, 300 million gallons per day, is considered to be the safe yield of the entire MWRA system. And they were over that safe yield back in the 80s into the 70s. You can see they were up around 330. They were a good bit over that when the MWRA took over the system. Their demand management program has brought the demand down to at or below 200 million gallons per day. So they have now basically lopped off more than a third of the demand that they once had. And they have basically, up to almost, in theory, 100 million gallons of water that in the Quabbin Wachusett system that they're not using, that the current users are not using. And for that reason, MWRA is actually very interested in opening up to new communities, new customers. They've expanded a few places around the region. Up in the north side, Reading has come in, Wilmington's in the process, Burlington's applied for it, Stoughton has come in, Dedham, Westwood. There's been a few new entries over the last few years. But the big caveat, of course, is there's a cost that comes with this. It's not cheap, and it's in most cases quite a bit more expensive than the existing local water supplies that communities now have. So for that reason, communities are not across the board just exactly lining up for this. I think a few communities that have a very substantial need have come in. There's an entrance fee that's required to join the MWRA that amounts to $1 million for every 100,000 gallons per capacity. So and then of course, if you're not that close to the MWRA, you'd also have to pay for whatever physical infrastructure it took to connect into the system. So that's just to point out, because the question usually comes up, we're close enough to the MWRA, and again, the Union Point is being considered. And if you consider that if in the future Union Point does get themselves into the MWRA system, then in a sense that brings the MWRA that much closer to the next tier of towns. So in the longer term future, it may become an option to think about, but it's not anything in the immediate short term. And if we would jump ahead to the next slide, Betsy, what I'm going to do now is just give a quick highlights that the information that Weston & Sampson has pulled together to give a snapshot of the existing conditions for the water supply systems in the 5 towns that we're working with. And so all 5 towns do have municipal water systems, of course. The quick profile that we have here, the main things that I'm taking a look at here are what are the permitted withdrawals, that's the third, and then the last line in each of these, and what was their existing water demand. The permitted withdrawals is how much that water system is allowed under the Water Management Act, which is the state permitting process that sets ceilings on overall withdrawals. So quickly you can see in Hanover that their existing demand of 1.25 is pretty close to their permitted withdrawal. They have a little bit of leeway, but not an awful lot. Likewise in Hingham, which as you probably all know, has fairly recently acquired what used to be a privately owned, investor-owned water company, now is a municipal system. And Hingham also serves the neighboring towns of Hull and parts of Cohasset. And so their demand, they have a little bit of leeway there compared to their permit, but again, not an awful lot. If we go to the next slide, Betsy, the next couple towns we pulled together the data for were Norwell and Rockland. Again, 1.14 for Rockland, for Norwell rather, as a permanent withdrawal, and nearly almost 1 for the demand. Again, everyone is below their permits in these communities, but just below them, not leaving a large amount of and then when we come to Rockland, Abington, which are the part of the joint system between the two towns, there's a little bit more leeway there between the difference between the permitted withdrawal. And also their permitted amount of 3.11 could potentially be increased to 3.36 if they were to conduct some additional mitigation that would be required under the permit. So there's a little bit more there that you could look at. And if you go to the next slide, the last town on the list is Weymouth, which actually has a permitted withdrawals of 5 million gallons per day. And last year's demand was 4.5. So they actually had a 500,000 gallons per day difference between those two numbers, more so than any of the other towns here. And I will mention that, you know, in years past, Weymouth was at or over their limit. And this goes back maybe 20 years or so. They put in place a very robust water banking program, which has actually really paid off over the years. So they got themselves into a good situation where their demand is now at or below their permitted amounts. These numbers really do need to take with a bit of grain of salt because they can vary seasonally. They can be higher in dry years, et cetera. You know, water demand does go up and down and fluctuate, but these are pretty good indicators of what the snapshot is. What I did, just to get an interesting overview from all 5 towns, is I just totaled them all up in this last part, the lower part of this chart, to see when you look at all 5 towns and aggregate them all together, the permitted withdrawal of all of their water sources together in the 5 towns is 14.1 million gallons per day. And the current demand in all of these 5 towns adds up to 12.5. So there's 1.6 or so million gallons per day of difference spread across the whole region. So that's a pretty thin margin, you know, spread across all five entire towns. It really gives you the sense that yes, there's some water supply capacity, and there's some ability to absorb some growth. Some in more towns than others. It looks like a little bit more ability in Weymouth and in Rockland and even a little bit less in some of the other towns. So that's something to consider. Let's think about the wastewater side of the picture. And once again, setting the regional context on the wastewater side of matters, what's the situation with the MWRA? Well, here we have a case where actually 2 of the towns are in the current MWRA sewer system, wastewater system. Weymouth is for the entire town, and the North Sewer District in Hingham, just a small part of the town, which includes some area around the town center, is within the MWRA wastewater district. However, the situation with the wastewater district in the MWRA is different than their water supply. They are not in the market for new customers to join the wastewater system because they really don't have the same kind of additional capacity that they do in the water system. If you go to the next slide, Betsy, you'll see one of the factors is that all of the flow coming, this is all part of that south system. You saw that there's a north and south system. All of the flow coming out from Weymouth and Hingham comes up through Braintree-Weymouth Tunnel, which is actually a fairly recent upgrade to what was at once called the Braintree-Weymouth Interceptor, which was a very severely limited sort of choke point in the system. So with that newer project, they have overcome the choke point for the existing users there. But they really haven't planned for this system to accommodate a lot more flow. And even Deer Island itself, the treatment plant, it was such an expensive long-term project when that harbor cleanup project was put in place. They did not build a huge amount of additional capacity into that plant to envision a significant expansion of the wastewater system. So really wastewater, the MWRA is not really a potential solution beyond the towns, the Weymouth and Hingham that you see in there now, the way the water potentially theoretically might be in the future. Just go ahead, Betsy. So we did the next overview here of the local situation, because unlike water, where every town does have a water system, and just a matter of what's the volume and what's the demand versus their capacity. In wastewater, the picture is more complex. We have a couple of communities, and this map goes beyond the 5 of the project that we're just doing now. The project we're doing now, once again, is Hanover and Hingham and Rockland, Norwell, and Weymouth. We sort of looked at the whole South Shore here on this map. The status of wastewater. So those that are sewered in the MWRA system, you see in the dark kind of brown-red color to the north. And it's not showing the Hingham North District, but that's actually part of it as well. And then those that are sewered completely with a local treatment system is really just two rather, Hull and Rockland. And then a number of the other communities that you see in the hatching are partially sewered. There are sewer wastewater plants and wastewater collection systems in parts of the communities, tend to be in town centers and more dense portions of the communities. And then 2 of the communities, notably Hanover and Norwell, do not have any municipal wastewater at all, which means that all systems are either Title V in-ground systems, or if they're larger developments, larger than the Title V will allow, typically for commercial, industrial, et cetera, and larger residential, they would be privately owned wastewater, and there's a number of those. So let's jump ahead, Betsy, to the next slide, which starts to look through the status of, yes, I can wrap up in 2 minutes. We're getting very close. Basically, this is a similar analysis we did in the water to look at what we have. In the case of Hanover, where there is no municipal system, what Weston and Sampson was able to do is take a look at the development sites that Betsy had showed you in the beginning, the 6 different development sites, and find what nearby proximate private facilities are there. That if you had ways of having some kind of an agreement or a purchase of capacity or something of that sort. And in the case of Hanover, there are 3 of these facilities, but one of them, this St. Coletta's School, Cardinal Cushing, doesn't seem to have any additional capacity available. 2 different sites near the Unicorn development need further looking into. Weston and Sampson wasn't sure whether those sites would be able to accommodate any additional flow from neighboring areas. So that's one of the things that we'll be looking into in more detail. In the case of Hingham, we do have the North Sewer District that's part of the MWRA, but that boundary is defined and it really can't expand. And it's way up in the northern end of Hingham. There is this very small Weir River Sewer District that sends wastewater from a part of Hingham over into Hull. It's a very small section of just some residences. There's a private wastewater treatment plant near the development sites that we're looking at in Hingham, which is the South Shore Industrial Park and Derby Street. Again, not sure about whether there's any capacity to think about those as being shared resources. And in Norwell, again, there's no municipal system. There's one private wastewater treatment plant that looked like it would be theoretically possible, but expensive, probably too expensive to be considered for the nearby development site. In Rockland, where we do have the municipal system, they have a discharge permit of 2.5 million gallons per day, which they are within that limit, but they do have inflow and infiltration requirements that need to be met for dealing with high flow management. And the town is starting a comprehensive wastewater assessment at this point. And finally, you have Weymouth, which is a full member of the MWRA system. They have, their demand is around 8.5 million gallons per day. And the one development site we're looking at there could pretty easily tie in there. So Weymouth is in the best shape of all the communities in terms of its ability to do that. And so finally, so for communities that have these capacity constraint limits, obviously there may be ways in some cases, but they're expensive to expand those limits. And also they often would require permit requirements, which are very difficult these days to do. Maybe not impossible, but very difficult. Other measures that could be considered would be, are there any intermunicipal initiatives where on one side of a town boundary you have a little bit of capacity, and another side of a town, different town boundary, you have a projected development that could purchase some of that capacity, or similarly between private and public facilities, as we talked about a few, especially on the wastewater side of these private facilities that exist, could they actually serve a neighboring or nearby site with obviously with the proper kinds of purchase arrangements for capacity and all of that. For water supply, if you look at what the MWRA did with their demand management, they really bought themselves an awful lot of new capacity without putting any new sources onto the system. Not everyone's going to be able to be quite that dramatic, but basically demand management and water efficiency measures really are often the first best way of getting more capacity out of the existing systems to then accommodate more growth. In particular, seasonal peak demand reduction, because many of our water systems are okay on their average annual flow, but they reach these big seasonal peaks in the summer. And that's, if you can shave those summer peaks, you can actually then make some more capacity available in your system. Measures like water banking, which has been very successful in Weymouth. On the wastewater side, it's all about inflow and infiltration, because that again is what drives your peak demand in those systems and makes it very difficult to add more facility. And water reuse is a kind of an approach that might be possible in some probably larger scale developments. We have a few cases where that is in place now, like in the premium outlets in Rentham, actually at Gillette Stadium, some other facilities. On the right, you see a couple of guidebooks that MAPC had put together to deal with, give some best practices for some of these issues on the summer water demand and on the water reuse. And if anyone would like copies of those measures, we have PDF versions of those. So actually that wraps it up for me, and I'll pass it back. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Martin and Betsy. And Martin and Betsy, if you want to share the links to those reports with me, I'm happy to share those with everyone in a follow-up email.
Thank you.
Wow, lots of information to digest. I'm gonna go ahead and just keep moving with the speaker presentation. Just, you know, we've kind of heard this national, more like framework presentation. We've heard kind of the regional perspective with some examples some examples about water and wastewater capacity, potential solutions, how we're looking at it with a subset of South Shore towns. And I want to turn it over to Jim Boudreau from the town of Scituate. He's a town administrator there. Jim has, you know, years of experience, first in Norwell, then in Scituate. And I'm hoping he'll be able to share some of his kind of local level insight, experience in what something like water and wastewater capacity really means from an economic development standpoint in a community, in a neighborhood. So Jim, I'm going to turn the floor over to you, and then I promise we will leave, you know, the last 10 to 15 minutes for some questions from the audience. Jim, the floor is yours.
Sure, and I won't be that long. No presentation for me, you just get to see the Scituate sunrise behind you. By way of introduction, I'm a South Shore kid, grew up in Quincy. My first introduction to storage was probably swimming in Wollaston Bay before they fixed it. So it's been a while. I've been in Scituate for 3 years. Before that, 17 in Norwell, and I was up on the North Shore. Actually, Linfield has a split water district. I was there for 3 years. Half the town is on town water and half is on MWRA. And going from one side of town to the other was literally like Dorothy opening the door at Oz. One side of the town is all burnt and brown because it's under a water ban, and the other side is green and lush and beautiful. And it just really emphasizes the need for water and how it works. So Scituate is a pretty good example of infrastructure needs for water and sewer. First Storage, we do operate a municipal water treatment plant. It's right underneath the wind turbine on the Driftway across from the golf course. We're a little under 30% stored for the town, mostly the southern end and down the harbor and along some of the Ocean Way. We have an annual discharge permit of 1.6 million gallons per day. We average about 1.4 to 1.5 million gallons per day. So we're very close to our limit, and we actually need to save that capacity, because when we get a nor'easter and we get flooding, our annual average daily flows can go up over 3 million gallons a day. We have such a problem with inflow and infiltration and water coming in and getting into our system. So we are very close to our permanent limit, which means in essence that we don't have any capacity to do a large scale project along what Martin showed you for those water usages. It also means that those area town, like North Scituate Business District, like Minot, like the Glades, which are in Northern Scituate, are not connected to our source system at all, and we don't have the capacity right now to connect those to our source system. So first, let me talk about the Greenbush area. The Greenbush area is in the southern part of Scituate. It's right off the rotary on 3A, where the Greenbush train station terminal is. We have been working to develop that parcel and those parcels for years, unsuccessfully, because we have not had any capacity in our wastewater system. We are now in the process of building a 78-unit apartment complex on the overflow parking from the T with retail below and some office space. It's going to take up about 30,000 gallons of capacity a day. Where did we get it? We partnered with the Drew company who was building the project, and we got a $2.2 million MassWorks grant to do I&I work at Cedar Point, which is where our lighthouse is. We get about 40,000 gallons a day estimated of I&I in our Cedar Point lines. So we're doing almost a $7 million project to close those lines up, and that will create the capacity for the Drew project. We've started that. We did the laterals first, which are the connections from the house into the mains. We found laterals that weren't connected. We found laterals that were crushed. We found laterals that were completely blocked. And each one of those connections was where water was just going directly into our system and eating up our available capacity. So we're looking to break ground on the Drew project in March. The Cedar Point project, if you want to go out there, we're down 14 to 16 feet in some places, putting in manholes, putting in pipes, but that will connect to our existing system and just take out excess use that we have that is damaging our plant and using our capacity. North Scituate is really another example of the need for capacity. North Scituate has the North Scituate train station. It has ample parking. It is right off Route 3A. It is close to the beaches, and it is dying because it does not have storage. Some of you will remember Jamie's Pub, which was in North Scituate. Jamie's Pub unfortunately had a fire, I believe at the end of 1997. When Jamie was looking to rebuild, he came to the town and said, I cannot afford to rebuild and still have to pump my septic systems. It's too expensive. So we actually gave him an agreement where he was paying the same amount to dump his septic as if he was connected to the source system, which was a significant reduction in what he was paying, in the hopes that he would be able to rebuild Jamie's. He is not. It is not because of the surge at this point. There's some other issues, but that was a big blow to North Scituate in terms of walking and people going there and people being there. So we've been working on that for quite a while. There is really no place in North Scituate where we could build or construct a treatment facility to handle their storage. So we need to find a place to bring it, and we need to either create capacity in our system to bring it down to our treatment plant. And we actually, the town was pretty forward thinking when the MBTA went in. We actually had them install sewer lines under the crossings for the train already. So those are there. We can use those. We don't have the capacity. Before I got here about 4 years ago, Hull and Cohasset approached Scituate with the idea of looking at a regional solution to the storage needs that we have. We don't have any capacity. Cohasset had some areas that they wanted to store, and the town of Hull is actually sitting on about 1 million gallons of permitted capacity that they are not using. And they're going to upgrade their storage treatment plant, and they will give up some of that capacity so that they don't spend too much money on the new plant. So the thought was Cohasset and Scituate could send some storage over to Hull to use their capacity. They also have what's called an outfall, an ocean outfall. You can't get those anymore. Scituate's outfall goes into the North River. we estimated it cost us about $25 million, even if we could get a permit to put it out into the bay. So this was a thought that we could really take advantage of permanent capacity and deal with our problems. We would put North Scituate in there. We would put the Glades area in there. We would put Minot in there. Those are areas that border the ocean, border the river. It would have some real good environmental impact by storing those. North Scituate would have an economic impact. The original plan would have actually run a pipe from North Scituate and the South Main Street area, Cohasset, and would have gone up Route 3A in Cohasset, eventually connecting into the Hull system. As we looked at that, that was a lot to bite off. It was very expensive. The town of Cohasset was still working on their master plan, so they really did not want to soar 3A at that point without having their master plan in place. So we scaled it down after discussions with the Cohasset Sewer Commission, and we were going to soar North Scituate, and then it was going to go down, the pipe would go down South Main Street, which connects North Scituate to Cohasset, pick up that area of Cohasset. That sewage would go to the Cohasset treatment plant, and then Cohasset would wheel an equal amount of sewage from other parts of town to Hull through an existing connection that they already have. We tested that. It did work. It did put some stresses on the Cohasset system that would have to be fixed before we could put that into operation. But right now, the town of Cohasset has put the brakes on the project. They are looking at all their options for a Cohasset only solution. We are waiting to hear back from them whether they want to move forward with that or not, but we are not waiting. We need to create about 125,000 gallons of capacity a day to do the North Scituate Business District. As build out under the zoning, it is zoned for exactly what Chris talked about. It is zoned for mixed use, apartments above, retail below, parking in the back, walkable around the transit station. We want to move, if you get down there now, you'll see the big parking lots are in the front. We want to move the buildings up to the street. So we're ready to go from a zoning standpoint. We're ready to go from everything except having the storage. The other main advantage that we saw of the regional project, it is economic development. It would be housing creation. It would be transit oriented. It would have environmental benefits, and it would be a regional solution. So every box that the state basically has on a grant application, we would be able to check. One of the issues with doing these infrastructure projects, you do an infrastructure project hoping to attract business, but you have to balance the cost of that infrastructure to make sure that when you put it in, you're not making it too expensive for business to actually want to come there when they add up the taxes, the water, and the sewer. So that was very, very attractive to us from a monetary standpoint. We're hoping to hear from Cohasset soon as to what they want to do with that project. In the meantime, we are designing other I&I projects in town to create the capacity that we need to get North Scituate sewered. That is the #1 priority of the Board of Selectmen. We want to do that. And we think once it's done, depending upon the greater economy, obviously, that North Scituate will begin to be developed in the manner that we want it to be developed. And I think people will really take advantage of it. We know some of the owners down there have already talked to us. They're just waiting for us to tell them sewer's coming. It's going to be here at this time, and then they'll start their processes to permit and get construction going. So it's very exciting if we can get the storage down there, which we're working on. Water, the other side of that coin, like a lot of towns on the South Shore, we have water bans on an annual basis. I always like to quote Steve Ives, who's a water superintendent in the town of Norwell, who likes to say, we have plenty of water for people. We have plenty of water for pets. We don't have water for pet grass. So if you look at Scituate, we do about 1.1, 1.3 million gallons a day on average. On the 4th of July weekend, we'll do 2.7 to 2.9 million gallons of water a day. This past year, we were over 2.5 million gallons a day at the end of June, which is very high for us. We estimate a lot of that was because people have been home. They weren't working in town, they were home. When we put the water ban on outside watering on, our water usage dropped almost 500,000 gallons a day just by stopping outside watering. So we have some water, we have the ability to get it, but we need to conserve it better. The other issue that Scituate has really had, for those of you who know it, is brown water. The system was so old and so full of iron and manganese, when our water usage jumped on the 4th of July, it would rile up iron and manganese that had been in the system for years and change the water color. I don't know if you can see this. This will show the water sitting in the bottom. That's the type of stuff that was in the water that would come out of suspension when the water usage went up. We've spent over $30 million in the past 10 years to fix that, to fix the water quality. We have another $30 to $40 million water treatment plant project that is currently in the planning stages. So we're going to spend between $60 to $70 million to repair our water system without adding a single drop of water to our supply. So we have the current project on the reservoir. If you drive down Route 3A this summer, you can see that empty mud flat. That was our reservoir. It is full now. We have a project right now in permitting to add about a 30-day supply by raising the reservoir. We have a second project at the Dolan well fields that will add another 200 to 300,000 gallons a day in well water when that's permitted. But they're all going to cost money, and they're all going to cost water to go up to the ratepayers. So, one of the things we talk about and we ask our legislative delegation about is we need federal and state help to fund these projects. Right now, we get low or no interest loans. They're great, but I still have to pay them back. And when you look at what is happening to the water rates, what's happening to the sewer rates, as we make improvements to the system, as I said earlier, we will reach a point where we will be concerned about people's ability to locate their businesses here when they calculate the tax cost, the water cost, and the sewer cost. So we are looking at the regional sewer solution. If I could get a pipe from the MWRA, I would think about it, but it would have to come from every other town. So we are at the end of the pipe, as you can see behind me. You get to the end of Scituate, you're at the end. So it does make some of those costs a little higher, but we are working as diligently as we can on our infrastructure problems to make sure that we're open for business and the business can come. So the Greenbush is sewered. We have a lot of development going up there, not just Drew, a lot of multifamily homes going up in that area. Some other retail stores going up in that area that are in the planning stages. So that area is going to really pop. And we know if we can get that capacity for North Scituate, that we can get that going too. So that's kind of the day-to-day nuts and bolts that we deal with here in terms of capacity. When I first got to Norwell, I didn't know what a septic system was. I lived in Quincy my whole life. I flushed it out to the ocean. So that was kind of a shock. But now back in Scituate, we are dealing with that. And it's a lot to deal with. It's a lot of work. The system is going to have to be upgraded. You put your water treatment plants near the water. We're in the process of doing a resiliency study for our water treatment plant to make sure that if sea level starts to rise, the water treatment plant is going to be protected. And that's going to cost us money. So it's really a balancing act. As Chris says, if you can do those dense areas, this economy of scale is much better than having to run a pipe 2 miles to get 2 houses at the end of the line. But the cost of just doing the dense areas is going to be something that we're going to have to grapple with. So at that, I don't want to go too much longer than that, and I'll open it to if people have questions.
Great, thanks, Jim. Appreciate that. Betsy, Martin, Chris Zimmerman, and Jim are open for question and answer at the moment. If you have a question, please use the chat function or just use your raise hand and I'll unmute you. I want to leave it open to the audience first, but if there's no pressing question at the forefront, I have a couple too. Peter, you're unmuted. Did you have something you wanted to say? No.
No.
Okay, gotcha. All right, where are we at? Okay. I know that someone earlier had asked, let's see, how does COVID play into this with people leaving cities? It's a broader question. I know Chris mentioned, it doesn't really, but I wonder if Jim or Betsy or Martin, if you have any thoughts on really, I would think an increased pressure on suburban areas to come up with some solutions to water and wastewater capacity challenges due to the exodus from some cities. Exodus might be a strong word, but.
I think, as I said earlier, we've seen our water and soil use go up. It is much higher than it would be on a normal basis as people are here. So that has been an issue that we've had to grapple with. We've spent a lot of time with Peter and the chamber on transportation issues, the proposed cuts to commuter rail and to rapid transit. We think could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. People aren't taking the train because they can't get into town. Well, if you cut the transit, they won't be able to get to town and they're not going to go back. So if you combine that with COVID, that could change some of the way businesses operate. You won't have the same amount of office space as people will be able to work from home and telecommute. I think, not so much COVID as the fact that COVID has allowed that to happen. We could see some pickup from that with more people working from home and that daily use staying on a high basis going forward.
Courtney, sorry, go ahead, Betsy.
I'll just add quickly, Chris, I think your perspective, it's hard to know how things are going to play out, but I think we're not seeing as much of an exodus. And there's a lot of articles at the beginning of folks really, transitioning out into other places because they could work remotely. I think we're going to see some still like strong demand for office space, but I also think there's going to be shifts in how people are working, and they might not be working as frequently from their offices, maybe 3 days a week. That might change transportation demand. But also we're really seeing how it's going to play out in terms of business development and where people are attracting talent. I've heard from some employers that they are hiring remotely because frankly, there's not enough housing in the region, and they're saying if folks can stay where they're located, we can hire. So I think we're going to see it play out in interesting ways, but I don't think there's going to be as much of an exodus as was predicted. But I think it really actually speaks to the strength of the South Shore for both supporting employers, but also providing the housing options that are necessary.
Yeah, I think we have to, distinguish. I mean, every time there's a summer vacation, there's an exodus from cities, right? But, some of these things are transitory. So we have to distinguish between the things that are transitory and the things that are long-term. We certainly, in this environment right now, things are really different. If you told me that we were going to be living like this for the next 10 years, God help us, then I'd have a different, forecast to give, right? But, this has happened before. We've had a long history. There have been plagues. We know what happened in the bubonic plague that wiped out, a third to a half the population of Europe, especially in cities, and people fled cities. And guess what happened after that? The Renaissance. Cities grew like never before. You can go time after time after time. So all the things that drives people to cities and towns are still in place. And once you get past a pandemic, those things are going to tend to come back. So also, we're not actually seeing an exodus. I mean, despite the talk about this, what we are seeing is kind of interesting. There are impacts, for instance, places that are maybe a little less crowded, but that, the most valuable places are places that have the 15-minute neighborhood, the place that isn't super dense, but you can walk to a lot of things. That's the place you want to be under these circumstances. And that's already showing up, and I think will tend to show up, going forward. Keep in mind that there will be changes. So the fact that we've all learned we can do this, and I can do my job and have done my job now for 10 months without going back into the office, it's not that that's, not going to have any impact. It will. My organization, I'm sure, will be looking at our next lease on how much office space do we really need. We never used to let people really work much remote. We may try to do some of that now, but we're not going to go to completely this because we're also learning all the shortcomings of this. We still need to get people together. So where all this shakes out is not 100% clear, but there's a lot of industry analysts right now saying they think the demand for office space is still going to be pretty good. And so, to expect, something kind of radically different a year or two after this is over is probably not likely, given the impact of the economic structure and the demographics. Those are factors that stay with us for decades.
Great, thank you all. Another question from Katie Lacey from Massachusetts Housing Partnership. Do you feel there is adequate communication between the state's environmental agencies and the governor relative to state housing and smart growth goals? So big question. It's in the chat if anyone wants to read it over again. So anyone want to take a first stab at that? No.
No, I don't. I think they're at odds too often. Sorry.
Okay. Gotcha.
Not only they at odds, but getting back to the whole talking about the cuts in transit and commuter rail, the governor's out here pushing transit-oriented development, and then he's cutting transit. So, the left hand doesn't always talk to the right hand, and it does become frustrating. I think this administration is better than a lot of administrations, but I don't think it's the way it should be.
All right, gotcha. All right, let's see, I'm just gonna read a couple of these. Ooh, Bruce, Bruce Hughes, given that most communities on the South Shore don't have public sewer systems and face citizen opposition to large multifamily housing projects because they don't want to be like Boston, how do you advocate for large housing projects that need on-site sewer systems other than in TOD districts? And I might tag on to that. How does a business community or business people, how do they help advocate for that too? So I'll open that one up to you all. Great question.
I can take a stab at it, and then I'll turn to my colleagues. Bruce, it's good to see you again. I think one thing just that in the question is becoming like Boston. And I think one of the things that we really work on is how do we respond to the character of each community and preserving the character while also responding to the broader economic development goals of each community. As we said earlier, and as the chamber is really committed to, is if we want to spur economic development, we're going to have to think through housing. And Jim, I know that's a lot of the work that you're doing in Scituate, is how do we provide additional housing options but that reflect the nature of our community and really preserve kind of the identity of the community. I think the multi-housing is challenging, and also that there's projects that have happened throughout the region where we've seen where they've been done well right near transit, and certainly I know, Jim, your thoughts on we've had all this TOD, and now certainly the threats to the transit system have been challenging, but I think there's been a number of examples that have been really thoughtfully done in partnership with the communities and really understanding kind of the market demand that have been well done. I think one of the challenges obviously is engaging the community and understanding where people are and also making the argument. And I think that's where the business community really comes in. And the chamber, I think, has been really helpful in this to say, how do we balance the need to, increase our commercial tax base, one, just for municipal finances, but two, also to provide additional workforce opportunities for people around the region. And then, how do we provide the housing to be able to do that? So I might turn it over to Jim or Martin if you have any other thoughts on that.
I guess it depends on which side of the coin you're looking at. So Norwell is all septic. Norwell is mostly single family homes. Norwell, when I was there, and I think still today, was vehemently opposed to large, particularly rental projects. Condo projects were not as bad, but rental projects vehemently opposed. So when you have a population that's vehemently opposed to them, as a government, you're generally going to be opposed to them, and a lack of storage is a good thing because a lot of times they can't figure out the septic disposal in order to build the type of project that they want to build. So you get around it that way. But the flip side of that is in a community like Norwell, where you have some open space, you generally will have enough space to get a septic system in, and they do get them in. You just try to put them in places where, so in Norwell, you look from up on 53, away from the problem with that is the business zone is only 50 feet wide. So everything backs up to a residential neighborhood. But I know they're looking at Queen Anne's Corner, which does not abut a lot of residential in that area in there. In Scituate, we try to keep them in the business district, which would be the Harbor, North Scituate, and then around the transit, Greenbush, and again, North Scituate. We do have a 40B going in on 3A right now. And the original proposal was an underground parking garage in an area that was regularly flooded by 2 to 4 feet of water in a storm event. And that's what they were going to build on that parcel, was going to have underground parking. So they do get, and that's no storage in that one. That's going to be a septic, finally get permitted. But if they really want to do it, they'll find a way to get it done.
I just like to note, this is not, this issue of people not wanting, being afraid of big projects and not wanting to be like Boston, as was entered in the chat. That's universal pretty much if you're in government. I mean, in my community here, where I live in the Virginia side of the Washington area, we have the same thing. In fact, we have a big, our big transit-oriented area is called Ballston, one of them with L's. And people in my community here, a couple miles south of that would say, we don't want to be Ballston, right? And that would drive a lot of the conversation. We don't want that. What we found was that the thing you have to do is give people an alternative, something to think about as a point of reference that isn't the thing they don't want, except that, okay, we agree, we're not going to be that. What are we going to be? What do we want to be? And, as I found working around the country, in pretty much every community, there is traditional development there that if you point to, people go, well, yeah, that's we've always had that they don't think of when they hear the word density, right? They picture downtown Boston, Manhattan, Hong Kong, something horrible, terrible, too many people, all that. But if you show them images of a lot of the stuff that was built, before 1950 or 1940, which includes a lot of nice traditional houses, some houses that turn out actually to be multifamily because they were right there tucked in the neighborhood, but they have 4 apartments in them, right? And even more. I use the Chattanooga example there, that wonderful neighborhoods that neatly tuck in apartments and single family houses in ways nobody even thinks about. And we run the numbers and we say that density supports an awful lot of better development and generates revenue effectively. And you could have public transportation because there's enough people there, but nobody thinks it's an overcrowded neighborhood. So the part of the key is getting a conversation going where you get it on the right terms, where you accept, yeah, we don't want that stuff here. That's definitely not here. And you give people some examples, often which are close to them, that they can see and say, okay, I could take one of those. The other part is explaining to them that we're not going to do this to 100% of the real estate. We only need to do it in a few places that make strategic sense. And part of what you get out of that is a tax base. And that was the deal that worked in my community, even before I came along with predecessors, that basically they found a way to get a tax base that would provide things people wanted and let them live mostly in the same neighborhoods they always did and always wanted. And I think it is possible, but it's a matter of getting that conversation going, which can be a challenge.
I mean, if you want to come to Scituate, we have a Seaside in Scituate, which is a 145 condos being over 55 being built by Toll Brothers.
Yeah,
it was the proving grounds. It was just empty space. The developer wanted to build over 200 apartments, I think 270 apartments. And in negotiating with the town, this is what they came up with. And people were, it's dense, if no one's gonna live there, well, oh my God. It's supposed to be a 5 to 6 year project. They're figuring they're gonna be done in 3 because they're selling the unit so quickly.
Yeah.
For way more than they thought they were gonna get.
Yeah, not surprised.
So as Chris said, I think the other one is if you want to go to Wildcat in Norwell, which is the only private sewer system that you're talking about, that was done when I was there. Those houses are on half an acre instead of an acre. So they're much closer together and people look at it and say, I wouldn't want to live that close to my neighbor. Oh my God. They're selling for way more than they thought they would. People love it. It is an unbelievable neighborhood. Fantastic place to go trick-or-treating. They do full-size candy bars. But
walkable.
Yeah, again, people look at it and said, no one's going to want to live there. It's tremendously popular when you build it.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you all. If you have another few minutes to hop on, I have one last question, if you might indulge me, from our president and CEO, Peter Foreman. He says a 15-minute walk is a nice measure. I think this question is for Chris Zimmerman. For urban or very dense areas. In suburban markets, is there a similar measure such as a 15-minute drive from home to work? We'll leave this as the last question, but curious your answer to that.
So Peter, I would say that shortest answer to that is, yeah, maybe. But keep in mind that a community that gives me a 15-minute, or less drive to all the things I want is going to be a walkable place. I would say I actually live in a place that could be described that way. I pretty much can get to everything within a 15-minute drive. I can also walk to a fair number of things within 15 minutes, not as much as I'd like, because I'm a little farther from it, in a single family house, but in a medium density. It's an older neighborhood, so it's fairly dense. And if down the block you get into townhouses and apartments, and then I got some things I could walk to. I can easily drive in 15 minutes to pretty much everything I need. But that's because it's a walkable community. Peter?
I should rephrase that a little bit. In the suburban market, some of what I think we're doing would be that you'll get sort of modified density mixed use, where you might have walkability to amenities from your home or your office, but you might have to drive, a short distance from home to office. Yeah. But at either end of those, you might have enough density and mixed use to. Yeah.
No, I think that's exactly where the future is for much of the suburbs, which are going to have to transform. And again, using the example of where I live, if you walk down the hill from my house and walk for, it's a little more than 15 minutes, there's a place which used to be a car-oriented, like, years ago, it was basically mostly parking lot with a big box store and, a movie theater and some restaurants. And now it's a mixed-use development of a couple million square feet that has a grocery store, a post office, and restaurants, but also people living there, apartments and condominiums all over it, townhouses around it. Now, I don't live in the middle of it, right? There's people who live right down there, can walk down, go downstairs and be at the grocery store or the restaurant or whatever it is. But I can walk to it, or I could drive to it in 10 minutes or less, right? I can walk to it in 15 or 20 minutes. And so it serves me that way, even though I'm still living in a comparatively lower density single family home. And I think that's creating these centers that are walkable and that provide those things for the market that is there. Like, Jim was just talking about, these things get gobbled up. It means that even those of us who, maybe we're not going to live that way, but we get the benefit of it, as well as getting a tax base that helps support the services we want.
All right, Chris, I think because we have a good group of people who are very involved in land use and planning, we should do a little bit of trivia. Is it true that the president of Smart Growth America actually coined the term smart growth, or is that just Wikipedia urban myth?
Well, actually, I think it's usually attributed to one of our founders who is still on staff, Paris Glendening, former governor of the state of Maryland. And he still does work part-time with us, and I've gotten to work with him a lot over the years. And when he was governor of Maryland, they put together, a program for the state trying to promote this idea. And part of the question was, I think, how to package it. And I believe that it was in discussions in his administration. I don't think he personally takes credit for having come up with it, but I do think it came out of his administration that first promulgated the name and kind of spread it around.
Then probably when he was in office, he took credit for it. Now he can be more modest.
Well, I'll certainly pass on the interest to the governor when I talk to him next.
All right, great.
Thanks,
I want to thank you all. Special thanks to our esteemed lineup of speakers today. We're very grateful to have you here, sharing your expertise, helping us to digest what is quite a big topic for us here in the region. So I want to thank you all for joining us. For those of you who are still on the line, I will follow up with the recording to the session along with the materials from the presenters. And we are here to chat with you more about our 2030 initiative, about economic development in the region. If you want to reach out, we are here. So thank you again for your time this afternoon, and we will see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you all.